deep in the misty Yorkshire moors, Willow Hall hides a chilling secret. When eerie wails, flickering lights, and a ghostly figure haunt the manor, Miss Jane Marple arrives, her sharp eyes unravelling a web of clues. A cryptic locket, a hidden passage, a diary's desperate plea, and a confession buried in a well. As shadows whisper of a long-ago murder, Miss Marple exposes the truth. No ghost, but a cunning plot for profit. In just days, she turns fear into justice, proving no secret escapes her quiet wisdom. Chapter 1. The invitation to Willow Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat in her cosy cottage in St. Mary Mead, her favourite armchair hugging her like an old friend. The fire crackled softly, spitting little sparks that danced before fading into the hearth. A cup of tea steamed on the small table beside her, its warmth curling into the chilly October air. Outside, the village was quiet, the kind of quiet that wrapped around you like a soft blanket, broken only by the rustle of leaves skittering across the cobblestones. Miss Marple's hands moved steadily, her knitting needles clicking in a rhythm, as old as time, weaving a scarf that was more habit than necessity. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her years, flicked toward the window now and then, as if expecting something to stir the stillness. She wasn't a woman who chased adventure. Adventure, she'd found, had a way of finding her. It crept into her life through the smallest cracks. A whispered rumour at the village shop, a nervous glance at a church tea, or, as it happened today, a letter. The postman had come and gone, leaving a single envelope on her doorstep, its creamy paper and elegant handwriting standing out like a peacock in a henhouse. Miss Marple had picked it up with care, her fingers tracing the wax seal, a fancy touch that spoke of old money and older secrets. The return address read, Willow Hall, Yorkshire, and the sender was Lady Beatrice Harrow, a friend from years past, though their paths had crossed only a handful of times. Miss Marple slit the envelope with a letter opener, her movements precise, and unfolded the paper inside. The words were written in black ink, the kind that flowed from a fountain pen, each letter curling with purpose. Beatrice's tone was warm, but tinged with something else. Worry, perhaps, or fear dressed up as politeness. The letter invited Miss Marple to Willow Hall for a weekend gathering, a small affair with a few guests. I'd value your company, Beatrice wrote, and, if I may be so bold, your wisdom. There have been unsettling occurrences here, things I cannot quite explain. Your knack for seeing what others miss would be a comfort. Miss Marple set the letter down. Her knitting paused. Unsettling occurrences. The phrase lingered like a shadow in a sunny room. Beatrice wasn't the sort to jump at ghosts or make mountains out of molehills. She was steady, practical, the kind of woman who ran her household with a firm hand and a kind heart. If something had rattled her enough to write those words, it was no small matter. Miss Marple's mind began to turn, piecing together what she knew of Beatrice and Willow Hall. The manor was old, centuries old, perched on the wild Yorkshire moors, where the wind howled like a lost soul. Beatrice had inherited it from her late husband, Sir Rowland Harrow, a man whose name carried weight in certain circles. Miss Marple had met him once at a charity event in London, and found him charming but guarded, as if he carried secrets he'd rather not share. The invitation stirred something in Miss Marple. Not excitement exactly, but a quiet curiosity, the kind that had led her to unravel many a tangle in St. Mary Mead. She sipped her tea, now lukewarm, and considered her options. She could stay here, safe in her routine, knitting scarves and chatting with neighbours about the price of eggs. Or she could go to Willow Hall, step into the unknown, and face whatever unsettling occurrences awaited. The choice was no choice at all. Her life, though simple, had taught her that mysteries were like weeds. Ignore them, and they'd choke the garden. Better to pull them out, root and all. She rose from her chair, her joints creaking just enough to remind her of her age, and crossed to the writing desk by the window. Her reply to Beatrice was brief but gracious, accepting the invitation and promising to arrive by Friday. She sealed the letter, set it aside for the postman, and turned her attention to practical matters. A weekend at Willow Hall meant packing, and Miss Marple was nothing if not practical. She chose her warmest dresses. Yorkshire was colder than St. Mary Mead, and old houses were draughty. Her knitting bag was a must, not just for the scarf, but for the way it kept her hands busy and her mind free to think. A sturdy pair of shoes, a shawl for evenings, and a small notebook for jotting down thoughts. She packed with the efficiency of someone who'd travelled light, but never unprepared. As she folded her clothes, her thoughts drifted to Willow Hall. She'd never been there, but she'd heard stories. The manor was said to be beautiful in a haunting way. Its stone walls weathered by time, its windows like eyes that had seen too much. Locals whispered of strange happenings, lights in empty rooms, footsteps where no one walked. Miss Marple didn't believe in ghosts, not in the way most people did. She believed in people, in their fears and secrets, and in the way those things could twist a house into something more than brick and mortar. If Willow Hall was haunted, it was likely by the living, not the dead. The next day passed in a blur of small tasks, arranging for a neighbour to check on her cottage, buying a train ticket, and tying up loose ends at the village knitting circle. Her friends were curious, of course. "Off to Yorkshire, Miss Marple?" asked Mrs. Price, her eyes wide. "Isn't that where that spooky old house is?" Miss Marple smiled, deflecting with a vague comment about visiting an old friend. She didn't mention the unsettling occurrences. Gossip spread fast in St. Mary Mead, and she had no intention of fueling it. Friday morning dawned grey and crisp, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. Miss Marple boarded the train at the village station, her suitcase light but sturdy. The journey to Yorkshire was long, with several changes, and she passed the time knitting and watching the world slip by. Fields gave way to hills, then to the rugged moors, where the land seemed to hold its breath. The train rattled through tunnels and over bridges, each mile taking her farther from the familiar and closer to the unknown. By late afternoon, she arrived at a small station near Willow Hall. The platform was nearly deserted, save for a porter who tipped his cap and a driver waiting with a car. "Miss Marple?" the driver asked, his voice gruff but kind. She nodded, and he took her, suitcase, leading her to a black sedan that looked as old as the manor itself. The drive was quiet, the road winding through moors that stretched like a sea of heather and stone. Miss Marple watched the landscape, noting the way the light seemed to dim, as if the sun were reluctant to linger here. Willow Hall came into view as they crested a hill, and Miss Marple caught her breath. The manor was grand, no question, but It carried an air of melancholy. Its grey stone walls rose 3 stories, dotted with tall windows that reflected the fading light. Ivy clung to the facade like fingers gripping something they feared to lose. The roof was a jumble of chimneys and gables, and a single tower stood at one end, its silhouette stark against the sky. The grounds were vast but unkempt, the gardens surrendering to weeds, and the paths half hidden by grass. It was a place that felt alive in a way, but not welcoming. The car crunched to a stop at the front entrance, and the driver opened her door. Miss Marple stepped out, her shawl pulled tight against the chill. The air smelled of damp earth and something sharper, like the memory of rain. Before she could knock, the heavy oak door swung open, and there stood Lady Beatrice Harrow. She was older than Miss Marple remembered, her hair more silver than brown, but her posture was straight, and her smile was genuine, if strained. "Jane, my dear," Beatrice said, clasping Miss Marple's hands, "I'm so glad you've come. It's been too long." Her voice was warm, but her eyes darted to the shadows beyond the door, as if checking for something, or someone. "It's good to see you, Beatrice," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm but observant. She stepped into the entrance hall, her shoes echoing on the polished stone floor. The hall was grand, with a sweeping staircase and walls lined with portraits, their subjects staring down with faded eyes. A chandelier hung overhead, its crystals catching the light from a few lit sconces. The air was cold, despite the fire burning in a massive hearth, and Miss Marple felt a prickle at the back of her neck. Not fear, but awareness. Beatrice led her to a drawing-room where tea was waiting. The room was cosy by comparison, with plush chairs and a roaring fire, but the windows rattled faintly, as if the wind outside were trying to get in. "The others will join us soon," Beatrice said, pouring tea. "I've invited a small group, people I trust mostly." "Well, as much as one can trust anyone these days." She laughed, but it was a thin sound, like glass about to crack. Miss Marple sipped her tea, letting Beatrice talk. The others were a solicitor named Mr. Clarence, a woman called Miss Lavinia, and a young doctor, Dr. Hugh. Beatrice described them briefly, but Miss Marple was more interested in what she didn't say. The way her hands tightened on her teacup. The way her gaze flicked to the door. Something was wrong here. Something deeper than a draughty house or a creaky floorboard. "Tell me about these occurrences," Miss Marple said gently, setting her cup down. "Your letter mentioned unsettling things." Beatrice hesitated, then leaned forward, her voice low. "It started a few months ago, after we began renovating the East Wing. Lights flicker when no one's touched them. Doors open on their own. And the whispers, Jane, soft, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Last week, a maid swore she saw a figure in the garden, a woman in white, there, and gone in a blink. She shivered, pulling her shawl closer. I don't believe in ghosts, but something's not right." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm but her mind racing. Whispers, lights, a figure in white, classic signs of a haunted house or of someone wanting it to seem that way. She'd seen such tricks before, in St. Mary Mead and beyond. People were clever when they had something to hide, and fear was a powerful tool. But she said none of this, only patted Beatrice's hand and promised to keep her eyes open. The sound of footsteps interrupted them, and the other guests arrived. Mr. Clarence was a tall man with a pinched face, his suit crisp, but his manner brusque. Miss Lavinia was small and fluttery, her eyes darting like a bird's, her hands clutching a handkerchief. Dr. Hugh was younger, with an easy smile and a warmth that put Miss Marple at ease, though she noted the way he watched the room, as if measuring it. Introductions were made, and the group settled into the drawing-room, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. Dinner was served in a dining-room that felt too large for 5 people. The table was set with silver and crystal, but the food was simple: roast lamb, potatoes and greens, hearty but not extravagant. Conversation was polite but strained, with Mr. Clarence complaining about the weather, and Miss Lavinia jumping at every clink of a glass. Dr. Hugh tried to lighten the mood with a story about a patient, but even he seemed distracted, his eyes straying to the dark windows. Beatrice said little, her smile fixed, and Miss Marple watched them all, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. As the meal ended, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and the chandelier above flickered, its light dimming for a heartbeat. Miss Lavinia gasped, and Mr. Clarence muttered something about faulty wiring. Beatrice's face paled, but she said nothing. Miss Marple, however, felt that prickle again, sharper now. The night was young, and Willow Hall was already whispering its secrets. She retired to her room, a spacious chamber with a 4-poster, bed and heavy curtains. The fire was lit, but the air was cold, and the shadows seemed to shift in the corners. Miss Marple unpacked her knitting, her notebook, and her thoughts. She wrote down what she'd observed: Beatrice's fear, Lavinia's nerves, Clarence's scepticism, Hugh's watchfulness. She noted the flickering lights, the whispers, the figure in white. And she underlined one word: why? Why now? Why these? Guests? Why Willow Hall? The answers were here, in the house or in the people within it. Miss Marple closed her notebook, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she believed in truth, and she'd find it, no matter how deeply it was buried. As she slipped into bed, the wind howled outside, and for a moment she thought she heard a faint wail, like a voice carried on the moor. She lay still, listening, but it didn't come again. Smiling faintly, she closed her eyes, let the house whisper, let the shadows move. Miss Jane Marple was here, and she was listening. Chapter 2. The Shadowed Arrival. The taxi's tires crunched on the gravel drive as it wound toward Willow Hall, the engine's low hum swallowed by the vastness of the Yorkshire moors. Miss Jane Marple sat in the back seat, her knitting bag nestled beside her, her eyes fixed on the landscape beyond the window. The moors stretched endless and wild, a sea of heather and gorse under a sky so heavy with clouds it seemed to press down on the earth. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp, soil and something older, like secrets buried in the stones. Dusk was creeping in, painting the world in shades of grey, and the manor loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the fading light. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her fingers brushing the soft wool as she took in Willow Hall. The house, Whodunit, grand, no question, but it felt heavy, as if it carried the weight of centuries. Its stone walls rose high, weathered by wind and time, with tall windows that glinted like eyes watching her approach. Ivy clung to the facade, twisting around corners like veins, and the roof was a jagged line of chimneys and gables, with a single tower stabbing the sky at one end. The gardens were a tangle of weeds and thorns, the paths half lost under grass. It was beautiful in its way, but not welcoming. It was a place that kept its stories close, and Miss Marple, who had a knack for coaxing stories out, felt a spark of curiosity kindle in her chest. The taxi jolted to a stop, and the driver, a grizzled man with a cap pulled low, opened her door. "Willow Hall, miss," he said, his voice rough but polite. "Mind your step. Ground's uneven." Miss Marple nodded, her smile small but warm, and stepped out, her sturdy shoes sinking slightly into the gravel. The air was colder here, biting at her cheeks, and the wind carried a low moan, like the moors themselves were sighing. She thanked the driver, who tipped his cap and carried her suitcase to the entrance, a massive oak door studded with iron. Before she could knock, the door creaked open, and Lady Beatrice Harrow stood there, her silver hair catching the dim light from the hall. "Jane!" Beatrice's voice was bright, but her eyes were shadowed, flickering with something that wasn't quite fear, but close to it. She wore a dark green dress, elegant but simple, and her hands reached out to clasp Miss Marple's. "You're here, at last. I was afraid the train might delay you." Her grip was firm, but her fingers trembled just enough for Miss Marple to notice. "No trouble at all," Miss Marple said, her tone calm and steady. "The journey was quite pleasant, though. The moors are a bit dramatic, aren't they?" She smiled, hoping to ease the tension in Beatrice's face. But the other woman's laugh was thin, like a thread about to snap. "Dramatic, yes," Beatrice said, stepping aside to let Miss Marple enter. "That's one way to put it. Come, in, please. You must be chilled." The driver set the suitcase inside, nodded, and retreated to his taxi, the engine rumbling as he vanished into the dusk. Miss Marple crossed the threshold, her shoes echoing on the stone floor of the entrance hall, and the door closed behind her with a thud that felt final. The hall was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows, with a grand staircase curving upward like a spine. Portraits lined the walls, their subjects frozen in time. Stern men in ruffled collars, women with sad eyes, all staring down as if judging the newcomer. A chandelier hung above, its crystals dull in the weak light from a few lit sconces. The air was cold, despite a fire crackling in a hearth so large Miss Marple could have stood inside it. She felt a prickle at the back of her neck. Not fear, but awareness. The kind that came when a place had more to say than its owners might like. Beatrice took her arm, guiding her toward a side door. "Let's get you settled," she said. "The others are in the drawing room, but there's time for tea before dinner." Her voice was warm, but her steps were quick, as if she wanted to leave the hall behind. Miss Marple followed, her eyes darting to the details, the worn edges of the rugs, the faint dust on the picture frames, the way the sconces flickered, though no draught stirred the air. Willow Hall was old, yes, but it was also alive in a way that made her senses sharpen. The drawing-room was smaller, cosier, with plush chairs arranged around a roaring fire. The windows were tall, but draped with heavy curtains, shutting out the moor's gloom. A tea tray sat on a low table, the pot steaming, and Beatrice poured 2 cups, her hands steadier now. "Sit, please," she said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You'll want to warm up. This house, it never quite feels warm, no matter how many fires we light." Miss Marple sank into the chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and accepted the tea. The cup was fine china, delicate but chipped at the rim, a small flaw that spoke of age and use. She sipped, the warmth spreading through her, and studied Beatrice. Her friend's face was lined, not just with years, but with worry, and her eyes kept straying to the door, as if expecting something to burst through. "You've gathered an interesting group," Miss Marple said, keeping her tone light. "Tell me about them." Beatrice hesitated, then set her cup down. "There's Mr. Clarence, a solicitor from Leeds. He's particular, but sharp, handles some of the estate's affairs. Miss Lavinia is a distant cousin of Roland's, my late husband, you know. She's nervous, always has been, but kind. And Dr. Hugh, a young physician from the village. He's been a help, checking on the staff when they're poorly. I thought a small group would be best, given the circumstances." "The circumstances," Miss Marple echoed, her voice gentle but probing. "You mentioned unsettling things in your letter. Perhaps you could tell me more." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes kind but unyielding, the way a grandmother might coax a child to confess a mischief. Beatrice's fingers tightened on her saucer. "It's hard to explain without sounding foolish," she said. "It started after we began work on the east wing. Repairs, you see, to fix the roof. Things changed. Lights go on and off, even when the wiring's been checked. Doors creak open at night. The maids hear whispers, like someone's talking just out of reach. And last week," she paused, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "one of the gardeners saw a figure in the orchard, a woman in white, standing, still as a statue. He blinked and she was gone." Miss Marple nodded, her face calm, but her mind was turning, sorting the pieces. Whispers, lights, a ghostly figure, classic signs of a haunted house, or of someone weaving a story to scare. She'd seen such tricks in St. Mary Mead, where a ghost turned out to be a neighbour's prank or a thief's cover. But Beatrice's fear was real, and that made the puzzle more interesting. "Have you seen this figure yourself?" Miss Marple asked. "No," Beatrice admitted, "but I've felt something, a chill sometimes in rooms that should be warm, a sense of being watched. I know it sounds silly, Jane, but I can't shake it." She looked down, her hands twisting in her lap. "That's why I asked you here. You've a way of seeing things, clearly, of finding the truth where others see only shadows." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch light but firm. "I'll do my best," she said. "Houses like this, they hold on to their stories. Sometimes it's just the wind or old pipes. Sometimes it's people, stirring things up for their own reasons. We'll sort it out." Her words were simple, but they carried a quiet strength, and Beatrice's shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The sound of voices broke the moment, and the drawing-room door opened. The other guests entered, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Mr. Clarence was first, a tall man with a face like a closed book, his suit crisp and his tie knotted tightly. His eyes flicked over Miss Marple, assessing her, and she met his gaze with a polite smile, noting the way he held himself, stiff like a man who trusted facts over feelings. Miss Lavinia followed, small and fluttery, her dress a faded shade of lavender. She clutched a handkerchief, her eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if expecting something to leap out. Last was Dr. Hugh, younger than the others, with dark hair and a smile that warmed the air. He moved with an easy grace, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail. Beatrice made introductions, her voice steadier now. "Miss Marple, this is Mr. Clarence, Miss Lavinia, and Dr. Hugh. Everyone, this is my dear friend, Miss Jane Marple, from St. Mary Mead." The group murmured greetings, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile warm, but her mind cataloguing their reactions. Mr. Clarence's nod was curt, Miss Lavinia's smile trembled, and Dr. Hugh's handshake was firm, his eyes lingering on her as if trying to place her. They settled into chairs, the fire crackling as Beatrice poured more tea. The conversation was polite but awkward, like a dance where no one knew the steps. Mr. Clarence complained about the roads, his voice sharp, as if the Moors had personally offended him. Miss Lavinia spoke little, twisting her handkerchief and jumping when a log popped in the fire. Dr. Hugh was the most at ease, sharing a story about a patient who'd mistaken a cold for the plague, but even his laughter felt forced, his eyes straying to the windows, where the night pressed close. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. She didn't need to speak much. People revealed themselves when they thought no one was watching. Mr. Clarence's briskness hid impatience, perhaps disdain for the ghostly talk. Miss Lavinia's nerves were real, but there was something else, a flicker of calculation in her eyes when she thought no one saw. Dr. Hugh was charming, but his charm was careful, like a man playing a part. And Beatrice, poor Beatrice, was trying so hard to keep the evening normal, but her hands shook when she refilled the teapot. Dinner was announced by a maid, a young woman with wide eyes who scurried out as if the room might bite. The dining room was grand but cold, its long table set with silver and crystal that gleamed under a chandelier. The meal was hearty, roast lamb, potatoes, and carrots, but the portions were modest, a sign of economy despite the manor's wealth. The group sat, their chairs creaking, and the conversation limped along. Mr. Clarence quizzed Beatrice about the estate's finances, his tone just shy of rude. Miss Lavinia dropped her fork twice, apologizing each time until Dr. Hugh gently told her to relax. Beatrice spoke of the renovations, her voice tight, and Miss Marple listened, her needles moving steadily, her eyes missing nothing. As the main course was cleared, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and the chandelier flickered, its light dimming, for a heartbeat before flaring back. Miss Lavinia gasped, her hand flying to her chest, and Mr. Clarence muttered about shoddy wiring. Beatrice's face paled, her fork clattering to her plate, and Dr. Hugh reached out, steadying her with a quiet word. Miss Marple watched, her mind turning. A flicker could be a fault, yes, but it could also be a signal, a trick to set nerves on edge. She filed the thought away, along with the way Beatrice's eyes darted to the door, as if expecting something to walk through. The meal ended, and Beatrice suggested they return to the drawing-room for coffee. Miss Marple excused herself, claiming a need to freshen up, and was shown to her room by the same nervous maid. The chamber was large, with a four-poster bed and heavy curtains that shut out the night. A fire burned in the grate, but the air was chilly, and the shadows seemed to shift, though nothing moved. Miss Marple unpacked her knitting, her notebook, and her thoughts, setting them out like tools. She wrote down what she'd seen: Beatrice's fear, Lavinia's nerves, Clarence's sharpness, Hugh's careful charm. She noted the flickering light, the wind's timely howl, the maid's wide eyes. She crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The moors stretched dark and endless, the wind stirring the heather like waves. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of white in the distance near the orchard, but when she blinked, it was gone. A trick of the light, perhaps, or something more. She let the curtain fall, her mind sharp as the needles in her bag. Back in the drawing-room, the group was quieter, the coffee cups clinking softly. Beatrice asked Miss Marple about St. Mary Mead, and she answered with stories of village life, her voice soothing, her eyes watching. The fire burned low, and the wind outside grew louder, rattling the windows like a fist. Miss Lavinia shivered, and Mr. Clarence checked his watch, muttering about early meetings. Dr. Hugh offered to check the windows, but Beatrice waved him off, her smile brittle. As the clock struck 10, Beatrice suggested they retire. "It's been a long day," she said, her voice strained. "We'll talk more tomorrow." The group murmured agreement, and Miss Marple followed the maid to her room, her steps slow but deliberate. She locked the door, not out of fear but habit, and settled into bed, her knitting bag within reach. The house was quiet now, but it wasn't still. Willow Hall was watching, waiting, and Miss Marple was ready to listen. As she closed her eyes, the wind howled, and a faint creak echoed from the hall, like a footstep on old wood. She lay still, her breathing steady, her mind awake. Let the house whisper, let the shadows play. Miss Jane Marple was here, and she was already unravelling the threads. Chapter 3. The Ghostly Whisper Miss. Jane Marple lay in the four-poster bed, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the Yorkshire night. The fire in her room had dwindled to glowing embers, casting faint shadows that flickered on the walls like nervous ghosts. The air was cold, seeping through the cracks of Willow Hall's ancient stones, and the wind outside howled, a restless moan that seemed to carry voices from the moors. Her knitting bag rested on the bedside table, her notebook tucked inside, but sleep eluded her. The house was too alive, its creaks and sighs too deliberate, as if it were whispering secrets meant only for those who listened. She had drifted into a light doze when a sound jolted her awake. A faint, mournful wail, like a woman crying far away. It was soft, almost lost in the wind, but unmistakable. Miss Marple sat up, her heart steady but her senses sharp. She slipped on her shawl, its wool warm against her shoulders, and reached for her slippers. The floor was icy under her feet, and the room felt colder now, as if the wail had brought a chill with it. She lit a candle, its small flame trembling, and moved to the door, her steps quiet but sure. If Willow Hall was speaking, she intended to hear it. The hallway was dark, the sconces unlit, and the air smelled of old wood and dust. The wail came again, fainter now, drifting from the direction of the staircase. Miss Marple held the candle high, its light carving a small circle in the gloom, and followed the sound. Her shadow trailed behind her, long and thin, merging with the shadows of the portraits lining the walls. The faces in the paintings seemed to watch, their eyes glinting in the candlelight, but she paid them no mind. She'd faced worse than painted stairs in St. Mary Mead. The staircase creaked under her weight, each step a small betrayal of her presence. She moved slowly, one hand on the banister, her candle steady despite the draughts that tugged at the flame. The wail grew clearer as she descended, a sound that was less human now, more like the wind shaped into grief. It led her to the ground floor, past the entrance hall with its looming chandelier, and towards the library, a room Beatrice had mentioned during tea. The door was ajar, a sliver of darkness spilling out, and the wail seemed to come from within. Miss Marple paused, her candle casting light on the door's carved panels. She listened, but the wail had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against her ears. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, the candle revealing a large room lined with bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. The air was colder here, sharp enough to make her breath catch, and the smell of leather and old paper hung heavy. A long table stood in the centre, cluttered with books and papers, and a single window at the far end rattled in its frame, the moor's darkness pressing against the glass. She moved to the table, her eyes scanning the shadows. The candlelight fell on a book, lying open as if someone had just left it. Its pages were yellowed, the print small and faded, but what caught her attention was the way the pages moved, fluttering slightly, though no breeze stirred the room. Miss Marple set the candle down, her fingers brushing the book's cover. It was a history of Willow Hall, its title embossed in gold, and the open page told of Lady Eleanor Harrow, Beatrice's ancestor, who had vanished in 1850 under mysterious circumstances. The text described Eleanor as a beauty, kind but headstrong, who loved the manor but feared its secrets. She had been engaged to a local gentleman, but rumours swirled of a rival, a friend who coveted her wealth. One night, during a storm, Eleanor disappeared, leaving only her shawl by the old well in the garden. The family searched, but no trace was found, and the manor mourned her, some saying her spirit never left. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she read, her mind filing away the details. Vanished well, shawl, rival. The page number 137 stood out, and she committed it to memory. As she reached to turn the page, the book slammed shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. Her candle flickered, nearly going out, and a cold gust swept through, though the window remained closed. Miss Marple stood still, her heart calm, but her senses alert. She didn't believe in ghosts, not the kind that haunted storybooks, but she knew the power of fear and the tricks it could play. Someone, or something, wanted her to notice this book, this page, this story. She reopened the book to page 137, but the pages were still now, the air heavy with a silence that felt like a held breath. She searched the room, her candle casting light into corners where shadows clung like cobwebs. The shelves held more books, some so old their spines were crumbling, but nothing else stood out. A fireplace sat cold and empty, its hearth swept clean, and a few chairs were scattered about, their cushions sagging. She checked the window, finding it locked tight, the latch rusted but firm. No draughts, no hidden doors, At least none she could see in the dim light, but the chill lingered, and the memory of the wail echoed in her mind. Miss Marple returned to the table, her fingers tracing the book's cover. Lady Eleanor's story was a clue, she was sure of it, but why now? Why lead her here, in the dead of night? She slipped her notebook from her shawl's pocket and jotted down the details. Eleanor, 1850, page 137, The Whale. She added a question. Who benefits? In St. Mary Mead, mysteries often hinged on gain. Money, love, revenge. Willow Hall was no different, she suspected, though its secrets were wrapped in older shadows. The house was quiet now, the wind outside muffled, as if it had spent its strength. Miss Marple took the candle and left the library, closing the door softly behind her. The hallway felt less oppressive, the portraits less watchful, but she moved carefully, her slippers silent on the stone floor. As she climbed the staircase, a faint creak came from above, like a floorboard settling, or a footstep quickly stilled. She paused, listening, but heard nothing more. Smiling faintly, she continued to her room, her mind turning over the nights, events like a puzzle piece that didn't yet fit. Back in her chamber, she locked the door and set the candle on the bedside table. The fire was nearly out, but she didn't relight it. The cold kept her thoughts sharp. She sat on the bed, her shawl pulled tight, and opened her notebook again. The whale, the book, the slamming pages, they were theatrics, yes, but deliberate. Someone wanted Eleanor's story known, or feared it being known. The chill, the gust, the book's movement, tricks perhaps, rigged by a clever hand. She'd seen such things before, in village scandals where ghosts hid theft or betrayal. But who? Beatrice was frightened, but her fear seemed genuine, not staged. Mr. Clarence was sceptical, dismissive of ghostly talk, which could be a cover or simple practicality. Miss Lavinia's nerves were real, but nerves could hide cunning. Miss Marple had known timid women with sharp minds. Dr. Hugh was charming, observant, but his warmth felt measured, like a man guarding his thoughts. And the staff, the nervous, Maid, the gardener who saw the figure, could be pawns or players. Too many pieces, not enough pattern, but Miss Marple was patient. Patterns emerged if you watched long enough. She tucked the notebook away and slipped under the covers, the bed creaking under her weight. The house was silent now, but she knew it wasn't sleeping. Willow Hall was a stage, and tonight's act had been for her, or for someone watching her. She thought of Lady Eleanor, vanishing in a storm, her shawl left behind like a breadcrumb. The well, the rival, the whispers of a restless spirit. Clues, yes, but also distractions. The truth, Miss Marple suspected, was closer, hidden in the living, not the dead. As she closed her eyes, the wind picked up again, rattling the window like a fist. A faint sound came from the hall, not a wail this time, but a soft thump, like something falling. She lay still, her breathing even, her mind awake. Let the house play its games. Let the shadows whisper. Miss Jane Marple was listening, and she was already threading the needle through the tangle. Morning came slowly, the sky outside grey and heavy, the moors shrouded in mist. Miss Marple rose early, her joints stiff but her resolve firm. She dressed in a warm wool dress, her shawl draped over her shoulders, and packed her knitting bag with her notebook and a pencil. Breakfast was served in the dining room, a quieter affair than dinner, with toast, eggs and tea. Beatrice was pale, her smile forced, and she asked Miss Marple if she'd slept well. "Quite well," Miss Marple lied, her tone cheerful. She didn't mention the whale or the library, not yet. Truths were best uncovered quietly, like dust swept from a corner. The other guests were subdued. Mr. Clarence read a newspaper, his frown deepening with each page. Miss Lavinia picked at her food, her eyes red as if she'd slept poorly. Dr. Hugh was the most alert, his smile easy, but his gaze sharp, lingering on Miss Marple as if sensing she'd seen something. She met his eyes, her expression bland, and offered a story about St. Mary Mead's church bazaar, deflecting attention. But she watched them all, noting the way Beatrice's hands shook, the way Lavinia's handkerchief twisted, the way Clarence's newspaper rustled when Eleanor's name came up in passing. After breakfast, Beatrice suggested a tour of the house, perhaps to lift the mood. Miss Marple agreed, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her eyes ready to catch what others missed. The group moved through the ground floor. Parlours, a music room, a conservatory with wilted plants. Willow Hall was grand but worn, its beauty fading under neglect. Miss Marple noted the details: loose floorboards, dusty curtains, a mirror that didn't quite hang straight. Small things, but small things told stories. In the library, she lingered, her fingers brushing the history book, still on the table, but closed now. Beatrice didn't mention it, and the others seemed uninterested, but Miss Marple felt the room's weight, its chill. She glanced at page 137, confirming the text was unchanged, and closed the book again, her smile serene. The whale, the book, the gust. They were threads, and she was weaving them together inch by inch. As they left the library, a maid hurried by, her face pale, whispering to another servant about a broken vase in the hall. Miss Marple's ears caught the words, fell on its own, and she filed them away. The house was speaking again, and she was listening. The day was young, and Willow Hall's secrets were only beginning to unravel. Miss Jane Marple, with her knitting and her quiet eyes, was ready for the next whisper. Chapter 4. The Clue in the Portrait. The morning mist clung to Willow Hall like a shroud, softening the manor's harsh edges, but deepening its air of mystery. Miss Jane Marple sat at the breakfast table, her tea cooling as she listened to the others' murmured talk. The dining room was quieter today, the clink of spoons against china the loudest sound. Beatrice's face was drawn, her eyes shadowed as if sleep had dodged her. Mr. Clarence folded his newspaper with sharp snaps. His frown carved deep. Miss Lavinia's hands trembled, her toast untouched, while Dr. Hugh sipped his coffee, his smile polite, but his gaze restless, flicking to the windows where the moor loomed grey and still. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap, her calm masking the whirl of her thoughts. The whale in the night, the book in the library, Lady Eleanor's story. They were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to fit them together. After breakfast, Beatrice suggested they gather, in the drawing room, perhaps to shake off the house's chill. Miss Marple followed, her knitting bag slung over her arm, her eyes catching the small details, the scuff on the staircase, the cobweb in a corner, the way the maid's apron was tied too tight, as if nerves had knotted her fingers. The drawing room was warmer, the fire crackling, but the air felt heavy, like a storm waiting to break. The group settled into chairs, their movements stiff, and Beatrice poured tea, her hands steadier, but her smile brittle. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a portrait above the fireplace, one she'd noticed the night before, but hadn't studied closely. It was of a woman, young and striking, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to pierce the room. Her dress was old-fashioned, a high-necked gown of deep blue, and her expression was calm but sad, as if she knew something the viewer didn't. The frame was gilt, ornate but tarnished, and a small plaque read Lady Eleanor Harrow, 1848. Miss Marple's pulse quickened, though her face stayed serene. The woman from the library's book, the one who vanished, was staring down at them, her presence as real as the fire's warmth. She rose, her shawl slipping slightly, and approached the portrait, her steps slow to avoid drawing attention. The others were talking, Mr. Clarence grumbling about the estate's upkeep, Dr. Hugh teasing Miss Lavinia about her fear of mice. But Miss Marple tuned them out. She studied Eleanor's face, the delicate curve of her jaw, the faint lines around her eyes that spoke of worry. The paint was cracked in places, but the artist had captured something alive, something that made the portrait more than canvas and oil. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the frame, where a faint inscription was carved into the wood, barely visible under years of dust. "Seek the truth in shadows." The words sent a shiver through her, not of fear, but of recognition. Clues in old houses were often hidden in plain sight, tucked into carvings or stitched into tapestries. She traced the inscription with a finger, her touch light, and felt a slight groove, as if the words had been etched with purpose. She stepped back, her mind turning. Shadows could mean many things: dark corners, secrets, lies. Or it could be literal, a hint to look where light didn't reach. She filed the thought away, her eyes lingering on Eleanor's, which seemed to follow her, steady and knowing. Miss Lavinia's voice broke her focus, high and shaky. "I saw her again last night," she said, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. The room went quiet, all eyes on her. In the garden, by the roses, a woman in white, just standing there, staring at the house. I couldn't move, and then she was gone. Her voice cracked and she dabbed her eyes, her face pale as milk. Mr. Clarence snorted, his newspaper rustling. "Nonsense! Moonlight and imagination, that's all. This house is old, not haunted." His tone was sharp, but Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened on the paper, as if he were convincing himself. Dr. Hugh leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Are you sure, Miss Lavinia? It was dark and the mist plays tricks. Maybe it was a shadow, or one of the maids." His smile was kind, but his eyes were sharp, watching Lavinia's reaction. "I know what I saw," Lavinia insisted, her voice trembling but firm. "It was her, I'm sure of it, Lady Eleanor, just like in the stories." She glanced at the portrait, then away, as if afraid to meet those painted eyes. Beatrice set her teacup down, the china clinking. "Let's not jump to ghosts," she said, her voice strained. "The house is unsettled, yes, but there's no need to scare ourselves." She looked at Miss Marple, a silent plea in her eyes, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring. but her mind racing. "Perhaps we should look around," Miss Marple suggested, her tone mild. "Old houses have stories, and sometimes they leave traces, letters, objects, things that explain what we see. A walk through the rooms might clear the air." She kept her voice light, as if proposing a stroll, but her eyes were on the group, watching for reactions. Beatrice seized the idea, eager for distraction. "Yes, a splendid thought. Let's explore the West Wing today. It's quieter, less drafty." She rose, smoothing her dress, and the others followed, though Mr. Clarence muttered about wasting time. Miss Marple brought up the rear, her knitting bag in hand, her senses alert. Lavinia's story, the portrait's inscription, the Whale Inn, the night, they were threads, and she was weaving them slowly but surely. The West Wing was a maze of rooms, some grand, some small, all heavy with age. The group moved through a ballroom with a chipped chandelier, a study lined with mouldering books, and a parlour where the wallpaper peeled like old skin. Miss Marple noted the details: a locked cabinet in the study, a cracked mirror in the parlour, a rug in the ballroom that didn't lie flat, as if something was hidden beneath. She said little, letting Beatrice guide the tour, but her eyes missed nothing. Old houses were like people. They hid their secrets in the smallest cracks. Miss Lavinia stayed close to Dr. Hugh, her steps hesitant, her eyes darting to every shadow. Mr. Clarence strode ahead, his hands clasped behind his back, as if daring the house to surprise him. Beatrice talked too much, her voice bright but brittle, pointing out faded paintings and worn furniture as if they were treasures. Dr. Hugh was the most relaxed, his comments light, but Miss Marple caught the way he paused at doorways, his gaze sweeping the rooms like a man searching for something specific. In a small sitting room, Miss Marple lingered by a window, its glass warped and streaked with rain. The garden below was a tangle of roses and weeds, and she pictured Lavinia's woman in white standing there in the moonlight. A figure could be a trick, someone in a sheet, a reflection, a lantern's glow. But Lavinia's fear was real, and fear was a clue, whether the figure was flesh or shadow. Miss Marple turned back to the room, where Beatrice was showing a carved mantelpiece, and her eyes fell on a small table, its surface dusty except for a clean circle, as if something had been moved. She crossed to the table, her fingers brushing the wood. "Beatrice, dear, was there something here?" she asked, her voice curious but casual. "A vase, perhaps, or a clock?" Beatrice frowned, thinking. "I don't recall. The maids move things, you know, for cleaning. I'll ask them." Her tone was vague, but her eyes flicked to the table, then away, as if the question unsettled her. Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, but her mind noted the clean circle, the dust, the way Beatrice's hands twitched. Something had been here, and someone had taken it recently. She filed the thought away, along with the inscription, Lavinia's story, and the library's book. The house was speaking, and she was listening, piecing together its whispers. The tour ended in the entrance hall, where the portraits stared down, their eyes cold in the morning light. Miss Marple glanced at Eleanor's portrait again, now hanging, in a different room, but brought to mind by Lavinia's tale. "Seek the truth in shadows," she murmured, too soft for the others to hear. Lunch was announced, and the group moved to the dining room, their steps echoing. The meal was simple: soup, bread, cheese, but the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Miss Lavinia barely ate, her eyes red, while Mr. Clarence quizzed Beatrice about the renovations, his tone sharp. Dr. Hugh told a story about a patient, but his laughter was forced, his eyes on Miss Marple, as if sensing her quiet scrutiny. After lunch, Beatrice suggested they rest, but Miss Marple asked to see the garden. "Fresh air does wonders," she said, her tone light, and Beatrice agreed, though her smile was tight. The group walked outside, the mist damp on their faces, the roses heavy with dew. Miss Marple moved slowly, her shawl pulled close, her eyes on the spot Lavinia had described. The rose bushes were overgrown, their thorns sharp, and the ground was soft, holding no clear footprints. But she noticed a broken stem, its cut fresh, as if someone had snapped it recently, perhaps last night. "Lavinia, dear, show me where you saw her," Miss Marple said, her voice kind but firm. Lavinia hesitated, then pointed to a gap between the bushes, where the house's windows glinted in the mist. "There," she whispered. "She was just standing, looking up." Her voice shook, and Dr. Hugh put a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes scanning the ground, the bushes, the house. A figure here would be visible from the upper floors, perhaps staged for effect. She bent, pretending, to adjust her shoe, and picked up a small thread of white fabric caught on a thorn. It was fine, like muslin, and she tucked it into her sleeve, her face unchanged, a clue, small but real, and she'd keep it close until it fit the pattern. Back inside, the group scattered. Mr. Clarence to the study, Miss Lavinia to her room, Dr. Hugh to check on a maid with a cold. Beatrice asked Miss Marple to join her for tea, but Miss Marple begged off, claiming a need to rest. Alone in her room, she opened her notebook, her pencil moving swiftly. She wrote, "Portrait, inscription, seek the truth in shadows. Lavinia's figure, white thread. Clean circle on table. Broken rose stem." She added, "Why Eleanor? Why now?" Someone was stirring the past, and the house was helping, willingly or not. She slipped the white thread into her notebook, its texture soft but strong. It could be nothing, a maid's apron, a curtain's hem, or it could be everything, a piece of the ghost Lavinia saw. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind sharp as the thorns outside. The day was fading, the mist thickening, and Willow Hall's secrets were growing clearer, like shapes in the fog. She'd find the truth, shadow or not, because Miss Jane Marple always did. As she prepared for dinner, a faint creak came from the hall, like a door easing open. She paused, listening, but heard only the wind, now a low growl. Smiling faintly, she tucked her notebook into her knitting bag and headed downstairs, her steps light but her eyes ready. The house was watching, and so was she. Chapter 5. The Hidden Passage. The afternoon light struggled through the mist, casting a pale glow over Willow Hall's stone walls. Miss Jane Marple stood in the drawing-room, her knitting bag at her side, her eyes drifting to Lady Eleanor's portrait. The inscription, "Seek the truth in shadows," lingered in her mind, a riddle wrapped in the house's secrets. The morning's tour, Lavinia's tale of the woman in white, the white thread on the rosebush, the clean circle on the dusty table, all were threads in a tapestry she was weaving, stitch by careful stitch. The group was restless, their voices low as they sipped tea, but Miss Marple's calm hid a mind as sharp as her needles. Willow Hall was speaking, and she was listening. Beatrice, pale and tense, suggested they explore the upper floors, perhaps, to keep the group busy. "The east wing's under repair," she said, her voice tight, "but the west wing has some lovely rooms." Mr. Clarence grumbled, his newspaper folded under his arm, but agreed. Miss Lavinia clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting to the windows, while Dr. Hugh nodded, his smile easy, but his gaze watchful. Miss Marple followed, her shawl pulled close, her senses alert. Old houses hid their truths in forgotten corners, and she meant to find them. The West Wing's hallways were narrow, the air heavy with dust and time. The group moved through a guest room with a sagging bed, a nursery with faded wallpaper, and a study where books lay mould track your progress. You've completed 4 out of 7 to 10 chapters for Miss Marple's chilling encounter with a ghostly clue. Chapter 5 is next, and you're aiming for 3,500 words with a compressed knowledge approach, using simple human-like words, grade 8 level, and avoiding AI-sounding terms. Keep the story cohesive, building on the clues, whale, book, portrait, thread, and maintaining Miss Marple's sharp, observant nature. Focus on the hidden passage discovery, advancing the mystery while setting up future reveals. You've got this keep weaving those threads earring. Miss Marple noted the details, a loose floorboard, a cracked window pane, a chair pushed oddly against a wall. Small things, but small things told stories. She lagged behind, her steps slow, her eyes scanning the walls for anything out of place. In a long hallway lined with faded portraits, she paused, her fingers brushing the panelling. The wood was dark, polished by years, but something felt wrong. The hallway seemed shorter than it should, as if the house were hiding space. She tapped the wall, her knuckles making a soft thud, and listened. Most panels sounded solid, but one gave a hollow echo, like an empty box. Her pulse quickened, though her face stayed calm. Hidden passages were rare in St. Mary Mead, but old. Manors like Willow Hall were built for secrets. She tapped again, tracing the panel's edges, and found a seam, barely visible under the grime. Pressing gently, she felt a click, and the panel shifted, revealing a narrow gap. Dust drifted out, tickling her nose, and a cold draught brushed her face, carrying the scent of damp stone. Miss Marple glanced back. The group was ahead, Beatrice's, voice echoing about a family tapestry. She pushed the panel wider, revealing a dark passage, its walls rough and unlit. Her candle from the night before was in her bag, but she didn't light it yet. Discovery was best shared, to see who flinched. "Beatrice, dear," she called, her voice mild but carrying. "You might want to see this." The group turned, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. Beatrice hurried back, her eyes wide, while Mr. Clarence frowned, Miss Lavinia gasped, and Dr. Hugh's smile faltered, his gaze sharp. "What is it, Jane?" Beatrice asked, peering into the gap. The draught stirred her hair, and she shivered, stepping back. "A passage," Miss Marple said, her tone light, as if finding secret doors were every day. "Old houses often have them, don't they? For servants or other purposes." She smiled, but her eyes watched the others, catching the way Lavinia's hands twisted, the way Clarence's jaw tightened, the way Hugh's fingers flexed, as if itching to explore. "Good heavens," Beatrice whispered. "I had no idea. Roland never mentioned—" Her voice trailed off, her face pale. Miss Marple noted the mention of her late husband, filing it away. Secrets in families were, like roots, deep and tangled. "We should look," Dr. Hugh said, his voice steady but eager. "Could be nothing, just storage, but it's worth a check." He stepped forward, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's, and she nodded, stepping aside. Let the young doctor lead. She'd see more from behind. Mr. Clarence snorted. A waste of time, probably a rat's nest. But he followed, his steps heavy, while Lavinia hung back, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Beatrice lit a lantern from a nearby table, its glow casting long shadows, and handed it to Hugh. Miss Marple pulled her candle from her bag, lighting it with a match, and the group entered the passage, their footsteps muffled by dust. The passage was tight, the walls rough stone, the air cold and stale. Cobwebs brushed Miss Marple's shawl, and she held her candle high, its flame steady despite the draught. The floor sloped downward, then levelled, leading to a small chamber, no bigger than a closet. The lantern's light revealed a wooden chest, its lid carved with vines, and a few scattered objects. A broken chair, a cracked mirror, a pile of rags. Miss Marple's eyes went to the chest, its lock rusted but intact, and she felt a spark of certainty. This was no accident. The passage was meant to be found, or meant to stay hidden. Dr. Hugh knelt by the chest, his fingers tracing the lock. "Old but solid," he said. "Might need a key, or a good pry." His tone was casual, but his eyes flicked to Beatrice, then Miss Marple, as if gauging their reactions. "Don't touch it," Mr. Clarence snapped. "Could be private property. We don't know what's in there." His voice was sharp, but his hands were clenched, and Miss Marple wondered what he feared. Thieves or something else. Lavinia whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. It's hers, isn't it? Lady Eleanor's. I feel it." She swayed, and Beatrice steadied her, though her own face was pale. Now, Miss Marple said, her voice soothing but firm. "Let's not jump to ghosts. Chests hold all sorts of things. Linens, papers, old keepsakes. We'll find out, but carefully." She knelt, her joints protesting, and examined the chest. Her candlelight caught a glint inside the pile of rags, and she reached in, pulling out a small locket, its silver tarnished but engraved with a delicate E. Her heart skipped, but her face stayed calm. "Look at this," she said, holding it up. The group leaned in, their breaths catching. Beatrice's eyes widened, and Lavinia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Clarence's frown deepened, and Hugh's smile vanished. His eyes locked on the locket. "It's beautiful," Beatrice whispered. "Could it be hers?" She didn't say Eleanor's name, but the weight of it hung in the air. Miss Marple opened the locket, revealing a faded miniature of a woman. Dark hair, sad eyes, unmistakably the face from the portrait. A scrap of paper was tucked inside, its edges frayed, the ink faint but readable. "Beware the one who smiles." The words were stark, a warning from a woman long gone, and Miss Marple felt the puzzle shift, new pieces falling into place. Eleanor's, no doubt, Dr. Hugh said, his voice low. But what's it doing here? And that note? He trailed off, his eyes on Miss Marple, as if expecting her to answer. Perhaps she hid it, Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Old houses have secrets, and people hide things when they're afraid. She closed the locket, slipping it into her sleeve with the white thread from the garden. She'd keep it safe and quiet until she knew more. "We should leave this place," Lavinia said, her voice trembling. "It's not right, digging up the past like this." She backed toward the passage, her eyes wide, and Beatrice took her arm, murmuring comfort. Mr. Clarence cleared his throat. "I agree, this is no place for us. Beatrice, you should have this sealed up. Could be dangerous." His tone was firm, but his eyes darted to the chest, as if it held something he didn't. "Want seen?" Beatrice nodded, her face pale. "I'll have the staff look into it. Let's go back." She led the way, the lantern's light bobbing, and the group followed, their steps quicker now. Miss Marple brought up the rear, her candle steady, her mind racing. The locket, the note, the passage, they were clues, deliberate and pointed, but to what? Eleanor's vanishing was at the heart of this, but why stir it now? Who gained from fear, or from truth? Back ascending the stairs to the main hall, Miss Marple paused, her hand on the banister, and glanced back at the passage's entrance. The panel was closed, but she felt its pull, like a whisper in the dark. She'd return, alone, when the house was quiet. Secrets didn't stay hidden forever, not from her. In the drawing room, the group settled, their faces strained. Beatrice poured tea, her hands shaking, and Miss Marple watched, her needles clicking. Lavinia sat by the fire, her eyes red, while Clarence paced, his newspaper forgotten. Dr. Hugh leaned against the mantel, his charm subdued, his eyes on the portrait. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind on the locket, the note, the passage. Beware the one who smiles. Someone in this room, perhaps, or someone long gone. She'd find out, thread by thread. Dinner was quiet, the food plain, stew, bread, apples, but the air was thick with tension. Lavinia barely ate, her fork trembling. Clarence quizzed Beatrice about the estate, his tone sharp, while Hugh told a story, his voice flat. Beatrice answered softly, her eyes on the table. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving, her eyes catching the small things. The way Lavinia's gaze flicked to Hugh, the way Clarence's hand paused when Eleanor's name was mentioned, the way Beatrice's cup rattled in its saucer. After dinner, she excused herself, claiming fatigue, and retired to her room. The fire was low, the air cold, but she didn't mind. She opened her notebook, her pencil swift. She wrote, "Passage, chest, locket with E, miniature of Eleanor. Note, beware the one who smiles." She added, "Who hid it? Why now?" The passage was old, but the rags were less dusty, the locket placed where it could be found. Someone was directing this play, and she'd unmask them. She slipped the locket and thread from her sleeve, studying them in the candlelight. The locket's silver was heavy, its engraving fine. The thread was muslin, fine but strong, like a veil or gown. She tucked them into her notebook, her mind on Eleanor's warning. Smiles hid lies in St. Mary Mead and here. She'd seen it before. Charm masking greed, kindness cloaking betrayal. The house was quiet, the wind a low moan. A faint creak came from the hall, like a door easing open, but she didn't stir. Let the house watch. Let the shadows play. Miss Jane Marple was weaving her net, and no secret would slip through. Chapter 6. The Midnight Vigil. The evening draped Willow Hall in a heavy quiet, broken only by the wind's restless howl across the Yorkshire moors. Miss Jane Marple sat in her room, the fire reduced to glowing coals, casting faint shadows that danced on the walls. Her knitting bag rested on the bedside table, her notebook tucked inside, its pages filled with clues, the whale, the library book, Eleanor's portrait, the white thread, the hidden passage, the locket with its cryptic note, "Beware the one who smiles." Each was a thread in a tapestry of secrets, and she was determined to weave them into truth. The house was alive, its creaks and whispers deliberate, and Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, was ready to listen. Dinner had been tense, the group's voices low over plates of roasted chicken and potatoes. Beatrice's hands shook as she poured wine, her smile brittle. Mr. Clarence's questions about the estate's value were sharp, his frown deep. Miss Lavinia barely touched her food, her eyes darting to the windows where the night pressed close. Dr. Hugh's charm was subdued, his stories flat, though his gaze lingered on Miss Marple, as if sensing her quiet scrutiny. She'd said little, her needles clicking, her thoughts on the locket hidden in her sleeve, its weight a reminder of Eleanor's warning. Now, alone in her room, she opened her notebook, her pencil moving swiftly. The passage's discovery had rattled the group. Lavinia's fear, Clarence's insistence on sealing it, Hugh's eagerness to explore, Beatrice's shock. The locket and its note pointed to Eleanor's fate. But why surface now? Someone was stirring the past, using fear to mask their purpose. Miss Marple closed the notebook, her mind turning. The house's ghostly tricks, wails, flickering lights, the woman in white, felt staged, like a village play meant to scare. She needed to test the stage, to see who pulled the strings. An idea formed, simple but bold. A vigil at midnight, in the library where the whale had led her. The group together, watching, would force the house, or its hidden player, to act. She'd seen it in St. Mary Mead, put people in a room with their secrets, and the truth squirmed out. She tucked the notebook away, slipped the locket into her knitting bag, and prepared for the evening's end, her resolve firm as the moor's stone. At bedtime, she joined the others in the drawing-room, where the fire burned low and the air was thick with unease. Beatrice offered brandy, her voice strained, and the group sipped in silence, the wind rattling the windows. Miss Marple set her glass down, her tone light but deliberate. "I've been thinking," she said, her eyes on the group. "These odd happenings, whales, lights, figures, might be better faced together. What if we held a vigil tonight, in the library, at midnight? We'd see what comes, or what doesn't." She smiled as if suggesting a game, but her gaze was steady, catching every flicker of reaction. Beatrice's cup rattled in its saucer. "A vigil! Oh, Jane, do you think—" Her voice faltered, but her eyes held a mix of fear and hope, as if trusting Miss Marple's calm. Mr. Clarence snorted, his glass thumping on the table. "Ridiculous! sitting in the dark, waiting for ghosts. I've better things to do." His tone was sharp, but his fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the unease beneath his bluster. Lavinia gasped, her handkerchief twisting. "In the library? At midnight? I couldn't. It's too frightening." Her voice trembled, but her eyes darted to Dr. Hugh, as if seeking rescue. Hugh leaned forward, his smile faint but curious. "It's not a bad idea. If there's something to see, we'll see it. If not, we'll sleep better knowing it's just the wind." His tone was easy, but his eyes locked on Miss Marple's, a challenge or a question in their depths. Beatrice hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's do it. Together it might settle things." Her voice was firm, though her hands shook, and Miss Marple smiled, her plan set. The vigil would stir the pot, and she'd watch the ripples. The group dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the hall. Miss Marple retired to her room, locking the door from habit, and prepared. She dressed warmly, a wool dress, her shawl sturdy, shoes, for the library was cold, and mysteries often demanded patience. Her knitting bag held her notebook, a pencil and the locket, its silver cool against her fingers. She added a small torch, its beam stronger than a candle's, and tucked the white thread beside the locket. Clues, small but heavy, and she'd guard them closely. At 11:30, she left her room, the torch unlit in her hand. The hallway was dark, the sconces dim, and the air smelled of dust and wax. The house was quiet, but not still. Creaks came from the walls, like whispers of old wood. She moved to the staircase, her steps silent, and paused at a sound. A faint shuffle, like someone moving in the shadows. She waited, her breath steady, but saw nothing. Smiling faintly, she descended, the library's door looming in the gloom. Others were already there, their faces pale in the lantern's glow. Beatrice stood by the table, her hands clasped, the history book closed but prominent, as if it had been touched. Clarence sat stiffly, his arms crossed, his scowl fixed. Lavinia huddled in a chair, her handkerchief a crumpled ball, her eyes wide. Hugh leaned against a bookshelf, his posture relaxed but his gaze alert, sweeping the room. Miss Marple nodded, taking a seat near the fireplace, her knitting bag at her feet. The library was colder than before, the air heavy, and the window rattled, though the latch was tight. "Let's keep the lantern low," Miss Marple suggested, her voice calm. "Enough to see, but not to chase shadows away." Beatrice dimmed. The light in the room sank into half-darkness, the bookshelves looming like silent watchers. The group sat, their breathing the only sound, and Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that grounded her thoughts. The clock on the mantel ticked toward midnight, each second heavy. Lavinia's breath hitched, and Clarence shifted, his chair creaking. Beatrice's hands twisted in her lap, and Hugh's eyes never left the door. Miss Marple watched them all, her mind on the wail, the book, the locket. The house was a stage, and the vigil was her cue to spot the actor. As the clock struck 1, a cold gust swept through, sharp and sudden, though the window stayed shut. The lantern flickered, its flame dancing, and Lavinia whimpered, her hands flying to her face. Clarence muttered, but his voice was tight, and Beatrice gasped, her eyes on the fireplace. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze sharp, and then she saw it. A faint figure by the hearth. A woman in white, her form hazy but real, her arm outstretched, pointing to the bricks. The figure shimmered, her face unclear, and then vanished, as if swallowed by the dark. Lavinia screamed, a high, broken sound, and collapsed, her body limp. Hugh was at her side in an instant, his hands checking her pulse, his voice calm but urgent. "She's fainted," he said, loosening her collar. "Just shock, she'll be fine." Beatrice knelt, her face pale, while Clarence stood, his fists clenched, his eyes on the hearth where the figure had been. "Trickery," Clarence snapped, but his voice shook, and he stayed rooted, as if afraid to move closer. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping, and crossed to the fireplace, her torch unlit but ready. The bricks were old, blackened by years, but one stood out, its mortar loose, its edge uneven. She pressed it, her fingers steady, and it shifted, revealing a small hollow. Inside was a key, iron and heavy, its teeth worn but sharp. She held it up, the lantern's light glinting on its surface. "Well now," she said, her tone mild, "this is interesting." Her eyes swept the group. Beatrice's shock, Hugh's narrowed gaze, Clarence's scowl, Lavinia's slow stirring. The key was a clue, deliberate and placed, and the figure was no ghost, but a performance meant to lead them here. "What's it for?" Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "Eleanor's, do you think?" Her eyes flicked to the portraits. Memory, though, it hung elsewhere, and Miss Marple noted the fear in her voice, real but tinged with something else, guilt, perhaps, or knowledge. "Could be," Miss Marple said, slipping the key into her sleeve with the locket and thread. "Old houses lock away their secrets. We'll find what it opens in time." She smiled, her calm a shield, but her mind raced. The figure, the gust, the key, they were staged, like the whale and the book. Someone knew the house's tricks, its passages, its hiding places. Someone wanted the key found, or feared it. Clarence cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Enough of this! I'm for bed! This is nonsense, all of it!" He strode to the door, his steps quick, but Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, the way his hands shook. Lavinia, now awake, clung to Hugh, her sobs quiet but steady. Beatrice stood, her face pale, and suggested they all retire. "We're tired," she said, her voice thin. "Tomorrow we'll think clearly." Miss Marple nodded, her knitting bag in hand, and followed the group to the hall. The house was quiet now, the wind a low moan, but she felt its eyes, its secrets pressing close. In her room she locked the door, lit a candle, and opened her notebook. She wrote, "Vigil, figure in white, gust, key in hearth." She added, "Staged, who, why?" The figure was no spirit but a trick. Projected light, perhaps, or a person in costume, using the passage to move unseen. The key was real, its purpose tied to Eleanor's fate, but its discovery was meant to stir the group, to push them toward, or away from, truth. She examined the key, its iron cold and heavy. It was old, likely, fitting a chest or door in the house's depths. The locket's note, "Beware the one who smiles," echoed in her mind, and she thought of Hugh's charm, Lavinia's timid glances, Clarence's forced bravado, Beatrice's strained warmth. Smiles hid lies, and she'd seen plenty in Willow Hall. She tucked the key, locket and thread into her notebook, her fingers brushing the white muslin, its texture a clue to the figure's costume. The house creaked, a floorboard sighing in the hall. She paused, listening, but heard only the wind, now a soft wail. Smiling faintly, she slipped into bed, her knitting bag close. The vigil had done its work, shaking the group, revealing the key, exposing the stage. Willow Hall was playing its part, and Miss Jane Marple was ready for the next act, her net tightening around the truth. Chapter 7. The Locked Chest. The dawn crept over the Yorkshire moors, its light weak and grey, barely piercing the mist that clung to Willow Hall. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her shawl tight against the morning chill, her knitting bag open. On the table, her notebook lay before her, its pages thick with clues. The whale, the library book, Eleanor's portrait, the white thread, the hidden passage, the locket with its warning, "Beware the one who smiles." And now the iron key. From the library's hearth, the midnight vigil had stirred the house, its ghostly figure a calculated act, and Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving the threads into a pattern. Someone was directing this play, using fear to hide or reveal, and she was closing in on the truth, stitch by careful stitch. The vigil had left the group shaken. Lavinia's fainting, Clarence's bluster, Beatrice's pale silence, Hugh's sharp gaze. They were all pieces, each reaction a clue. The key, heavy in her sleeve, was the latest, its purpose tied to Eleanor's vanishing in 1850. Miss Marple's eyes traced the moors, their heather swaying like a restless sea, and she thought of the locket's note, the portrait's inscription, "Seek the truth in shadows." The shadows were here, in the house, in the people, and she'd find them, no matter how deep they hid. Breakfast was a quiet affair, the dining room cold despite the fire. Beatrice's hands shook as she poured tea, her smile thin. Clarence read, his newspaper, his frown deeper than ever, while Lavinia picked at her toast, her eyes red and puffy. Hugh sipped coffee, his charm muted but his gaze alert, flicking to Miss Marple as if measuring her thoughts. She smiled, her needles clicking, and spoke of St. Mary Mead's weather, her voice light but her eyes missing nothing. The keys, weight pressed against her wrist, a secret she'd keep until the moment was right. After breakfast, Miss Marple suggested a search for the key's lock. "Old houses love their secrets," she said, her tone mild. "A key like that might open. Something important, papers perhaps, or keepsakes." Her eyes swept the group, catching Lavinia's gasp, Clarence's scowl, Hugh's raised brow, Beatrice's quick nod. "A fine idea," Beatrice said, her voice strained but eager. "The attic's full of old things, chests, trunks, Roland's papers. Let's try there." Her mention of her late husband lingered, and Miss Marple filed it away, noting the way Beatrice's hands twisted when she spoke his name. The group agreed, though Clarence muttered about wasting time. They climbed the narrow attic stairs, the air growing thick with dust and age. The attic was vast, its slanted roof criss-crossed with beams, its floor cluttered with crates, furniture, and cobwebs. Lanterns hung from hooks, their light casting long shadows, and Miss Marple held her torch, its beam steady. The group spread out, their footsteps muffled, their breaths visible in the chill. Miss Marple moved to a corner, her eyes scanning the clutter. A dusty mirror reflected her face, her shawl a soft grey in the gloom. She stepped past a broken chair, a pile of faded curtains, and stopped at a chest, its wood dark and carved with roses. Its lock was iron, rusted but solid, and her pulse quickened. She slipped the key from her sleeve, its teeth glinting, and tested it. The lock clicked, the sound sharp in the quiet, and the lid creaked open, releasing a puff of musty air. The others turned, drawn by the sound. Beatrice hurried over, her eyes wide while Lavinia hung back, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Clarence's frown deepened, and Hugh knelt beside Miss Marple, his gaze sharp, but his smile faint. "Well done, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "What's inside?" She lifted the lid fully, revealing a bundle of papers, a silk scarf, and a leather-bound book, its cover cracked but intact. Her fingers brushed the book, lifting it carefully. The spine read, "Eleanor Harrow, 1849–1850, and Miss Marple's heart skipped, though her face stayed calm. A diary, Eleanor's own words, hidden for over a century. She opened it, the pages brittle, and scanned the first entry. "The manor grows heavy, its secrets heavier. I fear the one I trusted most." The group leaned in, their breaths held. Beatrice's voice trembled. "Is it hers? Truly?" Her eyes were on the diary, but her hands shook, as if afraid to touch it. "It seems so," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. She turned the pages, her eyes catching phrases. "He smiles, but his eyes are cold. The well at midnight, betrayal wears a friend's face." The final entry, dated the night Eleanor vanished, was stark. "I go to the well to face him. If I do not return, let this be my witness." The words hung in the air, heavy as the attic's dust, and Miss Marple closed the diary, her mind racing. Lavinia whimpered, her voice barely audible. She knew someone meant her harm. Her eyes were wide, and she swayed, clutching Hugh's arm. He steadied her, his face grim, but his eyes flicked to the diary as if weighing its meaning. Clarence cleared his throat, his voice gruff. "Old scribbles, nothing more. Could be a story, not truth." But his hands were clenched, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way he avoided the chest. Beatrice reached for the scarf, her fingers trembling. "This was hers," she whispered, lifting the silk, its blue faded but soft. "I've seen it in the portrait." Her voice broke, and she pressed the scarf to her chest, her eyes on Miss Marple, pleading for answers. Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring, but her thoughts sharp. The diary was a treasure, its words a map to Eleanor's fate. But its discovery was no accident. The key, the passage, the figure, all led here to this chest, this truth. Someone wanted the diary found, or feared it. She slipped the diary into her knitting bag, along with the locket, key, and thread, and closed the chest, its lock clicking shut. "We should read it carefully," she said, her voice calm. "In the light, where we can think clearly. Diaries hold stories, but they need context." Her eyes swept the group, catching Lavinia's fear, Clarence's unease, Hugh's curiosity, Beatrice's grief. The diary was a spark, and she'd watch where it flared. They returned to the drawing-room, the diary a silent weight in her bag. Beatrice poured tea, her hands steadier now, and the group sat, their faces strained. Lavinia's eyes were red, her handkerchief twisted, while Clarence paced, his newspaper forgotten. Hugh leaned against the mantel, his charm subdued, his gaze on Miss Marple. She opened the diary, reading aloud the final entry, her voice soft but clear. I go to to face him. If I do not return, let this be my witness. The room was still, the fire's crackle the only sound. Beatrice's cup rattled, and she set it down, her face pale. The well, she whispered, in the garden by the roses. It's old, overgrown. I never thought. Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the way her eyes flicked to the window, as if seeing the well in her mind. Lavinia sobbed, her voice breaking. She's still there, isn't she? Her spirit, restless, pointing us to the truth. Her words were frantic, but her eyes darted to Hugh, then away, and Miss Marple wondered if fear hid something sharper. Clarence snorted, his voice sharp. Ghosts again? This is nonsense. A diary proves nothing. Could be a fake or a girl's fancy. But his hands shook, and he avoided the diary, as if its pages burned. Hugh spoke, his voice low. The well's a lead. We could check it, see if there's anything. Papers, objects, something she left. His tone was practical, but his eyes were on Miss Marple, as if testing her. She nodded, her smile serene. A sensible idea. Tomorrow, in the light, we'll look. Truth hides, but it doesn't run. Her words were calm, but her mind was on the well, the diary, the note. Eleanor's story was no ghost tale, but a crime, its roots in betrayal. The well was the next step, and she'd watch who flinched when they reached it. The group dispersed, their footsteps heavy. Miss Marple retired to her room, locking the door, and opened her notebook. She wrote, Attic chest, Eleanor's diary, final entry. Well, betrayal. Scarf, blue silk. She added, staged. The chest was dusty, but the diary's pages were less brittle, as if handled recently. The key's placement, the figures pointing, all led here, too neatly. Someone was guiding them, using Eleanor's tragedy to stir fear or truth. She examined the diary, its leather warm in her hands. The entries were brief but vivid, painting a woman trapped by trust, fearing a friend's smile. The well was central, a meeting place for a confrontation that ended in loss. Miss Marple thought of the white thread, the locket's note, the portrait's words. Shadows were clearing, and the truth was close, hidden in the house or its people. The scarf, left in Beatrice's hands, was a clue too. Its silk matched the portrait's gown, but its edges were frayed, as if torn in struggle. Miss Marple tucked the diary into her bag, with the locket, key and thread, and slipped into bed, the fire low. The house creaked, a floorboard sighing, in the hall, but she didn't stir. Let the shadows whisper, let the wind wail. Miss Jane Marple was ready for the well, and the truth it held. Chapter 8. The Truth at the Well. The dawn broke over Willow Hall with a grudging light, the Yorkshire moors shrouded in a mist that clung like a secret. Miss Jane Marple stood by her window, her shawl tight against the morning's bite, her knitting bag open on the table. Her notebook was thick with clues. The Whale in the Night, the library book, Eleanor's portrait with its cryptic inscription, the white thread from the roses, the hidden passage, the locket's warning. Beware the one who smiles. The iron key, and now Eleanor's diary, its final entry pointing to a midnight meeting at the well. Each clue was a thread, and Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving them into a truth that grew clearer with every stitch. The house was a stage, its ghostly acts, wails, flickering lights, the figure in white, staged by a human hand, and she was close to unmasking the player. The attic's discovery had shaken the group. Beatrice's grief over Eleanor's, Scarf, Lavinia's frantic fear, Clarence's dismissive bluster, Hugh's measured curiosity. They were all pieces, their reactions clues. The diary's words, "I go to the well to face him," were a beacon, pointing to Eleanor's fate and the well in the garden. Miss Marple's eyes traced the moors, their heather swaying under the mist, and she thought of the locket's note, the portrait's call to seek truth in shadows. The shadows were here, in the house, in the people, and today she'd pull them into the light. Breakfast was tense, the dining room's fire doing little to warm the air. Beatrice poured tea, her hands steadier, but her eyes shadowed, as if the diary's weight pressed on her. Clarence flipped through his newspaper, his scowl fixed, while Lavinia nibbled toast, her handkerchief crumpled in her lap. Hugh sipped coffee, his smile faint but his gaze sharp, lingering on Miss Marple as if sensing her purpose. She smiled back, her needles clicking, and spoke of St. Mary Mead's gardens, her voice light but her mind on the well, the diary, the truth waiting to be dug up. After breakfast, Miss Marple suggested they visit the well. "Eleanor's diary points us there," she said, her tone calm but firm. "It's a place to start, to see if anything remains, papers, perhaps, or a sign of what happened." Her eyes swept the group, catching Beatrice's quick nod, Lavinia's gasp, Clarence's frown, Hugh's raised brow. The well was the next act, and she'd watch who flinched when the curtain rose. Beatrice agreed, her voice tight. "It's overgrown, but we can manage. I'll fetch rope and tools." Her mention of the well stirred something. Fear, memory, guilt, and Miss Marple filed it away, noting the way Beatrice's hands twisted when she spoke of the garden. The group gathered in the entrance hall, their coats heavy against the morning's chill. Clarence muttered about wasting time, his breath visible in the cold air. Lavinia clung to her shawl, her eyes wide, while Hugh carried a lantern, his steps sure, but his gaze alert. Miss Marple followed, her knitting bag slung over her arm, the locket, key, thread, and diary safe inside. The garden was a tangle of roses and weeds, the mist damp on their faces, the air sharp with earth and decay. The well stood in a clearing, its stone rim mossy and cracked, its mouth dark and deep. Vines curled around it like fingers guarding a secret, and the ground was soft, holding no clear footprints. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the area, noting the broken rose stem from before, now wilted but still fresh. The white thread in her bag matched the scene, a clue to the ghost Lavinia saw, and she felt the puzzle shift, pieces locking into place. Dr. Hugh set the lantern down, its light weak in the mist. "It's deep," he said, peering into the well. We'll need the rope to check what's down there." His tone was practical, but his eyes flicked to Miss Marple, as if testing her resolve. Clarence snorted, his arms crossed. "Fool's errand. It's just a hole, probably dry, or filled with muck." But his voice was tight, and his eyes stayed on the well, as if it might bite. Lavinia whimpered, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. "It's her place, isn't it? Where she went, where she died." Her voice broke, and she swayed, clutching Beatrice's arm. Beatrice steadied her, her own face pale, her eyes on the well with a mix of dread and recognition. Miss Marple stepped forward, her shawl slipping slightly. "Let's be thorough," she said, her voice calm. "Eleanor's diary mentioned the well, and diaries don't lie, even if people do." Her words were gentle, but her eyes were sharp, catching Clarence's flinch, Lavinia's shudder, Hugh's faint smile. She knelt by the well, her joints protesting, and peered into its depths. The darkness swallowed the light, but a faint glint caught her eye, like metal reflecting far below. Hugh and Clarence tied the rope to a nearby tree, their hands quick but tense. Hugh lowered the rope, his movements steady, while Clarence held the slack, his scowl fixed. Beatrice and Lavinia watched, their breaths visible, their faces pale. Miss Marple stood back, her knitting bag at her feet, her eyes on the group, not the well. Truth came from people, not stones, and she'd see it in their faces. The rope went taut, and Hugh paused, his voice low. Something's caught, heavy, but not stuck. He pulled, his muscles straining, and Clarence helped, their grunts echoing in the quiet. Slowly, a rusted metal box emerged, its surface pitted but intact, its lock iron and heavy, like the key in Miss Marple's bag. The group gasped, their eyes locked on the box as Hugh set it on the ground, its weight sinking into the soft earth. Beatrice's voice trembled. "Is it hers? Eleanor's?" Her hands shook and she stepped back, as if the box might open itself. Miss Marple knelt, her fingers brushing the lock. "Let's see," she said, slipping the key from her sleeve. It fit perfectly, the lock clicking open with a sound like a held breath released. She lifted the lid, revealing a single paper, its edges yellowed but intact, sealed with wax. The seal was broken, and she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words, written in a hasty, desperate hand. "I, Edward Harrow, confess to the murder of my sister Eleanor for the estate she would inherit. I pushed her into the well. May God forgive me." The group was silent, the mist swallowing their breaths. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest, her eyes wide with shock. Lavinia sobbed, her knees buckling, and Hugh caught her, his face grim but his eyes sharp. Clarence's face was ashen, his hands clenched, and he stepped back, as if the confession burned. Miss Marple folded the paper, her voice calm but firm. "Eleanor's brother, Edward. The diary spoke of betrayal, and here it is, in his own hand." Her eyes swept the group, catching their reactions, Beatrice's tears, Lavinia's fear, Clarence's silence, Hugh's steady gaze. The confession was a key, unlocking Eleanor's fate, but it raised a new question. Why now? Why lead them to this truth? Beatrice's voice broke. "Roland, My husband. He was obsessed with the estate's history. He spent hours in the library reading old papers. Did he? No. Her eyes were on the confession, but her hands shook as if the truth was too heavy. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning. Roland's interest, Beatrice's fear, the staged ghost. They were connected, a plan to scare or reveal. Someone wanted this found, she said, her tone thoughtful. The whales, the figure, the key, all led us here. But why? Her question hung in the air, and she watched the group, seeing Lavinia's eyes dart, Clarence's jaw tighten, Hugh's faint frown. Hugh spoke, his voice low. Could be someone protecting the estate or hiding something else. A confession this old. It changes nothing legally, but it stirs trouble. His eyes met Miss Marple's, a challenge or a plea, and she smiled, her calm a shield. Clarence cleared his throat, his voice gruff. Enough! This is history, not our business. Seal the well, Beatrice, and be done. But his hands shook, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way he avoided the box. Lavinia's sobs quieted, but her voice was frantic. She's at peace now, isn't she? We found her truth. Her eyes were on the well, but her hands twisted, and Miss Marple wondered if her fear hid cunning. They returned to the house, the confession in Miss Marple's bag with the diary, locket, key, and thread. The drawing-room was warm, but the air was thick with tension. Beatrice poured tea, her hands trembling, and the group sat, their faces strained. Miss Marple opened her notebook, her pencil swift. She wrote, "Well, rusted box, Edward's confession, murder for inheritance." She added, "Staged. Why now?" The confession was real, but its discovery was orchestrated, like the figure, the key, the diary. Someone was using Eleanor's tragedy, and the answer was in the house, in the people. She sipped her tea, her eyes on the group. Beatrice's grief was real, but her mention of Roland's obsession was a clue. Did he find the confession, hide it, or use it? Clarence's unease suggested knowledge, perhaps of the estate's value, or its secrets. Lavinia's fear felt exaggerated, her glances calculated, as if playing a part. Hugh's calm was too perfect, his questions too pointed, like a man guarding his own secrets. The locket's note, "Beware the one who smiles," echoed, and Miss Marple thought of their faces, their masks. Lunch was quiet, the food simple, soup, bread, cheese, but the air was heavy. Lavinia barely ate, her eyes red, while Clarence quizzed Beatrice about the estate, his tone sharp. Hugh told a story, his voice flat, and Beatrice answered softly, her eyes on the table. Miss Marple listened, her needles moving, her mind on the well, the confession, the truth. The house was speaking, and she was close to its heart. After lunch, she retired to her room, locking the door. She opened her notebook, her pencil swift. The confession was a cornerstone, proving Eleanor's murder, but its timing was key. The ghost was a ruse, its tricks, wails, lights, the figure meant to scare or guide. Beatrice's fear, Roland's obsession, the group's reactions. They pointed to a living hand, not a spirit. She examined the confession, its paper old but intact, its wax seal broken, as if read before. The diary, locket, thread, key, all fit, but the why eluded her, a shadow she'd soon light. The house creaked, a floorboard sighing in the hall. She paused, listening, but heard only the wind, a low moan. Smiling faintly, she tucked the confession into her bag, with the diary, locket, key, and thread. The truth was near, its shape clear in the mist. Miss Jane Marple was ready for the final act, her net tightening around Willow Hall's secrets. Chapter 9. The Culprit Unmasked. The afternoon light faded over Willow Hall, the Yorkshire moors sinking into a twilight mist that pressed against the manor's windows like a curious ghost. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, her shawl snug against the chill, her knitting bag at her side, her notebook, hidden within, brimmed with clues. The midnight wail, the library book, Eleanor's portrait with its whispered "Seek the truth in shadows," the white thread from the roses, the hidden passage, the locket's warning, "Beware the one who smiles," the iron key, Eleanor's diary pointing to the well, and the rusted box with Edward's confession of murder. Each was a thread in a tapestry of deceit, and Miss Marple's mind was a loom, weaving them into a truth now, sharp and clear. The ghostly tricks, Wales' flickering lights, the figure in white, were no spirits but a human's work, and she was ready to name the hand behind them. The Wells discovery had cracked the group's fragile calm. Beatrice's tears over Edward's confession, Lavinia's frantic sobs, Clarence's tense silence, Hugh's measured questions, they were clues, each reaction a piece of the puzzle. The confession proved Eleanor's murder by her brother for the estate, but its timing was no accident. Someone had staged the Wales, the figure, the key's reveal, guiding them to the truth or away from another. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the portrait's memory. Its inscription, a call to look beyond the obvious. The shadows were lifting, and the culprit was here, in this room, wearing a mask she'd peel away. The group gathered after lunch, their faces drawn in the fire's glow. Beatrice poured tea, her hands trembling, her smile a fragile thread. Clarence sat stiffly, his newspaper folded, his scowl fixed. Lavinia clutched her handkerchief, her eyes red, her breaths shallow. Hugh leaned against the mantel, his charm subdued, his gaze sharp, lingering on Miss Marple as if sensing her purpose. She sipped her tea, her needles clicking, her voice light as she spoke of St. Mary Mead's church teas. But her mind was on the clues, the pattern now complete. The house had whispered its secrets, and she'd listened, ready to lay them bare. She set her cup down, her tone calm but deliberate. "We've found much these past days," she said, her eyes sweeping the group. "Eleanor's diary, the key, the confession, all telling a sad tale of betrayal. But these ghostly happenings, Wales, lights, the figure in white, they're no spirits, are they? Someone here has been directing us, using Eleanor's tragedy for their own ends." Her words were gentle, but they landed like stones, and the room stilled, the fires crackled loud in the silence. Beatrice's cup rattled, her face pale, directing. "Jane, you mean someone's been playing tricks?" Her voice shook, but her eyes held a flicker of hope, as if truth might lift the house's weight. Clarence snorted, his arms crossed. Preposterous! Who'd bother with such nonsense? It's just an old house creaking. But his hands clenched, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes darted to the door. Lavinia gasped, her handkerchief twisting. Tricks? But I saw her, the woman in white. It was real. Her voice was frantic, but her eyes flicked to Hugh, then away. And Miss Marple saw the calculation beneath her fear, a spark she'd suspected since the vigil. Hugh's smile was faint, his voice low. It's possible, Miss Marple. Old houses, old stories. Someone could use them to scare or distract. But who? And why? His eyes met hers, a challenge or a deflection, and she smiled, her calm a shield. Miss Marple leaned forward, her needles pausing. Let's consider the clues, she said, her tone thoughtful, as if unravelling a village gossip. The whale led me to the library, to Eleanor's story on page 137. The portrait's words, "Seek the truth in shadows," pointed to hidden things. The passage held the locket, its note warning of a smiling betrayer. The key opened the diary, and the diary led to the well, where Edward's confession lay. Each step was planned, like a path through the moors, to show us Eleanor's fate. But why now? Who gains? The group was silent, their breaths held. Beatrice's hands twisted, her eyes on the fire. Clarence's scowl deepened, his fingers tapping. Lavinia's sobs quieted, her eyes wide but sharp. Hugh's posture stiffened, his smile gone. Miss Marple continued, her voice steady. The ghost was clever. Wires for gusts, a projector for the figure, muslin for a gown. She slipped the white thread from her sleeve, holding it up. This, from the roses, matches the figure Lavinia saw. Not a spirit, but a costume, worn by someone who knew the house's secrets. Lavinia's gasp was sharp, her face paling. You think I made it up? Her voice trembled, but her hands shook, and Miss Marple saw the fear shift to defiance, a crack in her timid mask. Not made up, Miss Marple said, her tone kind but firm. You saw what you were meant to see, Miss Lavinia. But you also played a part, didn't you? The diary, the key, the figure all led us to the well. But they started with you. Your fear was real, but it hid something. You found the diary in the attic, didn't you? Not by chance, but because you knew where to look. The room froze, the fire's glow casting long shadows. Beatrice's eyes widened, her cup clattering. Clarence's jaw dropped, his bluster gone. Hugh's face was grim, his eyes on Lavinia, who shrank back, her handkerchief a shredded mess. Lavinia's sobs broke, her voice high and frantic. No, I didn't, I wouldn't. I was scared like everyone. But her eyes darted, her hands twisting, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her panic, the guilt beneath the tears. Miss Marple's voice was gentle, like a grandmother soothing a child. You found the diary, Miss Lavinia, and saw a chance. The beauty of estate's valuable, isn't it? Secrets like Edward's confession could stir trouble, raise its price, or scare Beatrice into selling. You knew the house's tricks, passages, wires, projectors, from Roland's papers perhaps, or old stories. You staged the wails, the lights, the figure, to make us believe in Eleanor's ghost, to push us to the well, to the confession. But fear makes mistakes, and yours was the thread, left on the roses and your eyes, always watching, always planning. Lavinia's face crumpled, her sobs turning to wails. I didn't mean harm. I needed money, and the estate, it's worth so much. I found the diary, yes, in Roland's things, and it told me everything. Eleanor, Edward, the well. I thought, if people were scared, Beatrice would sell and I'd get a share. I used the passage, the projector, but I didn't hurt anyone." Her words spilled a flood of guilt, and the group stared, stunned. Beatrice's voice was soft, broken. "Lavinia, how could you? This house, my home." Her tears fell, and she clutched the scarf, Eleanor's scarf, as if it could anchor her. Clarence cleared his throat, his voice gruff but shaken. "Despicable, playing with people's fears for profit. You should be ashamed." But his eyes were on the floor, as if he feared his own secrets might surface. Hugh stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "It's done, Miss Lavinia. The truth's out. The police can handle it now." His eyes met Miss Marple's, a nod of respect, and she smiled. Her work nearly complete, Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping, her voice warm but final. "The house is quiet now, Beatrice. Eleanor's truth is known, her brother's crime laid bare. The ghost was no spirit, just a trick, and tricks fade in the light. You can rest, and so can she." Her words were kind, but her eyes were on Lavinia, who wept, her mask gone, her plan unravelled. The group sat silent as the fire burned low. Beatrice called the village constable, her voice steady now, and Lavinia was led away, her sobs echoing in the hall. Clarence muttered about returning to Leeds, his bluster returning, while Hugh offered to stay, to help Beatrice settle the estate's future. Miss Marple packed her knitting bag, the locket, key, thread, diary, and confession safe inside, her notebook complete. The house was still, its whispers silenced, its shadows lifted. As she prepared to leave, Beatrice clasped her hands, her eyes wet but grateful. "Jane, you've saved us. I don't know how to thank you." Her voice was soft, and Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand. "Truth finds a way, dear," she said. "Like a good stitch, it holds if you're patient." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years, of mysteries solved, of hearts eased. The mist was lifting as Miss Marple stepped outside, the moors stretching wide and free. The house stood behind her, grand but lighter now, its secrets laid bare. She boarded the taxi, her knitting bag at her side, her mind already turning to St. Mary Mead, to tea and gossip and the next puzzle waiting. Willow Hall was at peace, and Miss Jane Marple, with her quiet eyes and sharper mind, had woven its truth thread by thread into the light. Chapter 10. The Calm. After the storm, the morning sun broke through the Yorkshire mist, casting a soft golden glow over Willow Hall's weathered stones. For the first time since Miss Jane Marple's arrival, the manor seemed to breathe easier. Its heavy air lifted, its shadows softened. She stood in her room, her suitcase packed, her knitting bag slung over her arm. Her notebook, tucked inside, held the story of the past days. The midnight wail, the library book, Eleanor's portrait with its call to seek the truth in shadows, the white thread from the roses, the hidden passage, the locket's warning. Beware the one who smiles. The iron key, Eleanor's diary, the well's confession, and Lavinia's unmasking as the orchestrator of the ghostly tricks. Each clue had been a thread, and Miss Marple's sharp mind had woven them into a truth that set the house free. Now, With the mystery solved, she was ready to return to St. Mary Mead, her work here done. The drawing-room was quiet, the fire's glow casting long shadows on the walls. Beatrice Harrow sat by the window, her silver hair catching the light, her face less strained than before, though her eyes still held a trace of grief. Dr. Hughes stood near the mantel, his charm subdued but his posture relaxed, a man at ease now that the truth was out. Mr. Clarence had left at dawn, his suitcase packed, his grumbles about Leeds fading with the taxi's rumble. Lavinia was gone, taken by the village constable, her tearful confession using wires, a projector, and muslin to stage a ghost for profit, still echoing in the room. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her calm a steady anchor as the group gathered one last time. Beatrice rose, her dark green dress elegant despite the morning's chill, and crossed to Miss Marple, her hands outstretched. "Jane, you've given me back my home," she said, her voice soft but firm, her eyes wet with gratitude. "I was so afraid, but you saw through the shadows, found the truth. I don't know how to thank you." Her grip was warm, her relief palpable, and Miss Marple smiled, patting her hand, her touch light but sure. "No need for thanks, dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, like a grandmother soothing a child. "Truth has a way of coming out, like a good stitch. It holds if you're patient. I only listened to what the house was saying." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years, of mysteries unravelled in quiet villages and grand manners alike. She glanced at the empty space where Eleanor's portrait hung in another room, its inscription, "Seek the truth in shadows," now a reminder of a woman's justice, not a haunt. Dr. Hughes stepped forward, his smile faint but genuine, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's with respect. "You're remarkable, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low. "I thought I was observant, but you see things most miss. Willow Hall's lucky you came." His handshake was firm, and she noted the steadiness in his gaze, the charm that had once seemed too polished, now softened by truth. He'd offered to stay, to help Beatrice with a physician's care, and Miss Marple suspected he'd be a friend to the manor in time. She nodded, her smile warm. "People are like houses, Dr. Hugh. They show their hearts if you watch closely. You've a good heart, I think." Her words were kind, but her eyes were sharp, catching the slight flush on his cheeks, the way he stood taller. She'd seen his curiosity, his questions, but no deceit, and that was enough. Beatrice poured tea, the china clinking softly, and the group sat, the air lighter than it had been. The fire crackled, its warmth spreading, and the windows rattled, less, as if the moor's wind had calmed. Miss Marple sipped her tea, its heat chasing the chill, and thought of the clues that had led her here. The wail that woke her, the library book open to page 137, the locket's warning, the key in the hearth, the diary's plea, the well's confession. Each had been a step, guided by Lavinia's tricks, but pointing to Eleanor's truth. Edward's murder of his sister for the estate was no longer a shadow, but a fact, laid bare by a rusted box and a desperate note. She'd given Beatrice the diary, the locket, the key, the thread, and the confession, their weight now hers to carry. "Keep them safe," Miss Marple had said, her voice firm. "They're Eleanor's voice, her justice. Let her rest." Beatrice had nodded, her tears falling and promised to honour the past, perhaps by restoring the well as a memorial. Miss Marple approved, her mind picturing the roses blooming again, free of thorns and fear. The drawing-room was quiet, the tea cooling, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Lavinia. The timid spinster had surprised her, her nervous facade hiding a sharp mind, driven by greed. She'd found the diary in Roland's papers, learned the house's secrets, passages, wires, a projector, and used them to stage a ghost, hoping to scare Beatrice into selling the estate for profit. The white thread, caught on the roses, had been her mistake, a clue to her muslin costume. Her confession, tearful and raw, had sealed her fate, and Miss Marple felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. Greed was a common thread in human hearts, as old as St. Mary Mead's gossip. Beatrice broke the silence, her voice soft. "Roland would have been grateful, Jane. He loved this house, its history, even its shadows. I think he might have known something, maybe found the diary too, but kept it quiet." Her eyes drifted to the scarf, Eleanor's blue silk, now folded on the table, its edges frayed from that fatal night. Miss Marple nodded, her mind on Roland's obsession, a clue Beatrice had mentioned early. He'd been a man of secrets, like the house, and perhaps his silence had fed Lavinia's plan. "People keep secrets for many reasons," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. Love, fear, shame. Roland protected the house in his way. Now you can protect it with the truth. Her words were gentle, but they steadied Beatrice, her shoulders lifting, her smile less brittle. Hugh glanced at the clock, its hands nearing noon. "Your taxi will be here soon, Miss Marple," he said, his voice kind. "The station's a bit of a drive, but the train's on time." He checked his watch, a practical gesture, and Miss Marple nodded, her knitting needles stilling. Her suitcase waited in the hall, light but sturdy, packed with her dresses, shawl, and the scarf she'd been knitting, now nearly done. She rose, her joints creaking faintly, and smoothed her dress. "Time does move on," she said, her smile warm. "St. Mary Mead's waiting, with its tea and chatter. But I'll carry Willow Hall with me, a story worth telling." Her eyes twinkled, and Beatrice laughed, a small, bright sound that warmed the room. They walked to the entrance hall, the grand staircase curving above, the portraits watching with softer eyes. The chandelier gleamed, its crystals catching the sun, and the air smelled of polish and hope, not dust. Beatrice opened the oak door, its hinges quiet now, and the taxi waited outside, its engine humming. The moors stretched beyond, their heather glowing under the clearing sky, no longer a restless sea, but a land at peace. Beatrice clasped Miss Marple's hands, her grip strong. "Come back, Jane," she said, her voice earnest. "Willow Hall's your home too now." Her eyes shone, and Miss Marple smiled, her heart touched. "If the moors call, I'll answer," she said, her tone light but sincere. "But keep the fires lit, dear, and the shadows at bay." Her words were a promise, and Beatrice nodded, her tears held back. Hugh carried her suitcase, his steps sure, and set it in the taxi's boot. "Safe travels, Miss Marple," he said, his smile genuine. "And watch for mysteries. They seem to find you." His tone was teasing, but his eyes held admiration, and she chuckled, her laugh soft. "They do, don't they?" she said, her eyes twinkling. "But I'm never alone. People tell their own stories if you listen." She shook his hand, grip firm despite her years, and climbed into the taxi, her knitting bag at her side. The driver, a grizzled man with a kind nod, started the engine, and the taxi rolled down the gravel drive, Willow Hall shrinking in the mirror. Miss Marple watched, her mind on the manor's stones, its secrets, its heart. The moors unfolded, their beauty stark but gentle now, and she felt a quiet joy, the kind that came from setting things right. She opened her knitting bag, her fingers brushing the scarf, its wool soft and warm. Her needles resumed their rhythm, the clicks a steady song, and she thought of Eleanor, no longer a shadow, but a woman avenged, her confession a light in the dark. The locket's warning, "Beware the one who smiles," had been true, but so was the portrait's call to seek truth. Lavinia's greed, Roland's silence, Beatrice's fear, Hugh's watchfulness. They were human, flawed, real, and Miss Marple understood them, as she understood her village's gossip and grief. The taxi wound through the moors, the hills rising and falling, the sky wide and blue. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to St. Mary Mead, its cottages and church, its small dramas and big hearts. She'd return to her armchair, her fire, her tea, but Willow Hall would stay with her, a chapter in her quiet life. Mysteries were like weeds, she'd thought on arriving. Pull them out or they'd choke the garden. She'd pulled this one, root and all, and the garden was blooming. As the station neared, the taxi slowed, and Miss Marple glanced out, the platform small but busy, the train's whistle faint in the distance. She paid the driver, her coins jingling, and stepped out, her suitcase light in her hand. The air was crisp, the sun warm, and she felt the world's pulse, steady and true. On the platform she waited, her knitting bag at her feet, her scarf growing stitch by stitch. A young woman nearby smiled, her baby cooing, and Miss Marple smiled, back, her eyes kind. People were stories, and she'd read many, each one teaching her more. The train roared in, its steam curling, and she boarded, her steps slow but sure, her place by the window waiting. As the train pulled away, she watched the moors fade, their heather a purple blur. Her needles clicked, her mind calm, and she thought of Willow Hall, its truth now free. Eleanor rested, Beatrice healed, and Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and sharper mind, was ready for the next story, the next thread, the next truth. The world was full of them, and she'd be there, knitting, listening, weaving the shadows into light.